Many famous people have believed that the Western nations are descended from the so-called Lost 10 Tribes of Israel. These include King George VI of the United Kingdom and Charles Fox Parham, who is considered to be the founder of the Pentecostal movement. This idea or theory started out with the so-called British-Israel movement in the 1830s, and in this video we're going to take a look at some of the most prominent British Israelites. The ancient nation of Israel consisted of 12 tribes. The 12 tribes of Israel left Egypt in the Exodus and settled in the land of Canaan, which became known as the land of Israel. After the death of King Solomon, the 12 tribes of Israel were divided into two kingdoms. The kingdom of Judah, with the capital Jerusalem, and which consisted of the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And the kingdom of Israel, which consisted of 10 Israelite tribes. The 10 tribes of Israel in the kingdom of Israel consistently worship pagan gods, and therefore the God of Israel let the Assyrian Empire invade the kingdom of Israel and deport most of the 10 tribes of Israel to northern areas of the Assyrian Empire. From there, the 10 tribes of Israel disappeared to world history and became known as the Lost 10 Tribes of Israel. The two tribes in the kingdom of Judah remained in the land of Israel and became known as Jews, which is a word that simply means men of Judah or Judahites. Even though historians and rabbis lost track of the whereabouts of the 10 tribes of Israel, many historians, Bible scholars, and rabbis have later traced their migrations to Europe, where the 10 tribes of Israel became the nucleus of the nations of northwestern Europe. In part 1 of this series, we showed how prior to 1830, at least 8 men wrote about this theory. They included 2 Orthodox Jews, that is Rashi and Don Judah ben Abarbanel, 2 Frenchmen, that is Le Loyer and Jacques Abadie, 1 Fleming, that is Adrian van der Schrik, 1 Swedish Lutheran pastor, that is Johannes Eurenius, and 2 Englishmen, that is Henry Spellman and Richard Brothers. The writings and ministries of these 8 men were, however, unfruitful and did not inspire any movements of Europeans that believed that they were Israelites. That, however, did take place when the Scottish clergyman of the Church of Scotland, John Wilson, started a series of lectures across Britain in 1836 and published the book Our Israelitish Origin in 1840. John Wilson's ministry started the British Israel movement, which had approximately 2 million followers in the early 20th century, including King George VI of the United Kingdom and many other pioneers of the Pentecostal movement, including Charles Fox Parham, who is widely considered as the founder of Pentecostalism, and Anna Bjørner, who is widely seen as the mother of Danish Pentecostalism. This video is a biography of some of the most prominent British Israelites. The British Israel movement inspired many other people and churches and movements that also believed in the British Israel message or parts of it. In this video, we'll focus on the traditional British Israelites, mainly in the United Kingdom itself. In coming videos, we will focus on the people, churches, and movements that were inspired by the original British Israel movement. These include the Anglo-Israel movement, which is similar but not identical to British Israel, Herbert W. Armstrong's Worldwide Church of God, and the notorious Christian Identity movement, the Orthodox Jewish Brit-Am organization, and recent Messianic, i.e. Christian Jews, who also believe in the existence of the 10 tribes of Israel, similar to what British Israelites believe. John Wilson, the father of the British Israel movement. John Wilson, who lived 1779 to 1870, was a Scottish Presbyterian clergyman and evangelist. He was born in Kilmarnock, Scotland, and resided in Cheltenham, England. John Wilson had studied the subject for some years, and in 1836 he began a series of lectures entitled Our Israelitish Origin, and summarized them in the book Our Israelitish Origin, Lectures on Ancient Israel and the Israelitish Origin of the Modern Nations of Europe, published in 1840. John Wilson's lectures and book was the beginning of the British-Israel movement. John Wilson viewed the British, Scandinavians, Germans, and other European peoples as the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. He viewed the Jews as Judah, but also acknowledged that Edom was a part of the Jewish people. John Wilson also wrote The Millennium or the World to Come in 1842, and sketches of some of the scriptural evidences respecting the so-called Lost House of Israel in 1843, and the Book of Inheritance and Witness of the Prophets respecting Ephraim and the raising up of Israel in 1874, and 60 Anglo-Israel questions answered in 1878, and the title deeds of the Holy Land and the mission of Elijah in 1881. Wilson wrote, we quote, "The two houses seem to have been intended to fulfill considerably different purposes in God's economy of grace to the world. Of Judah was to come the one promised seed, the heir of all things. Of Ephraim, the multitudinous seed, so much promised to the fathers, the many brethren who are also called the Lord's firstborn. Judah has been a standing witness to the prophetic word, whilst Israel, long to appearance lost, is to come forth with overwhelming witness to the truth in the latter time. Judah was the first fruits gathered in the apostolic age, but Israel is the harvest to be gathered at the Lord's return. Judah was privileged to carry the gospel to the north and northwest, to the many nations that have come of Jacob, and these are being employed in carrying it out thence unto all the ends of the earth. Judah and his brethren were to be preserved alive in the midst of famine, but this was to be accomplished by their unknown brother Joseph, who had been sent before them and given a headship over the heathen." Unquote. From John Wilson's book Our Israelitish Origin, pages 111 to 112. And again we quote, "The scriptures leaves captive Israel in the north, in the cities of the Medes, and in other places in the northern possessions of Assyria. Now it is a remarkable fact that to this very quarter are the Anglo-Saxons, traced by Sharon Turner in his valuable history of this people. Where Israel was lost, there the Saxons were found. Here are two puzzles which have been long enough before the historians. Whither went Israel, the most important people as to the promises and purposes of Jehovah? Whence sprung the Saxons, the most distinguished of all the families of mankind in the providence of God?" Unquote. John Wilson fully viewed the Germans as a part of the tribes of Israel. We quote, "It need scarcely be remarked that both poetry and music were greatly cultivated in Israel. These were accomplishments which, it might be expected, would be eminently possessed by a people who were to be peculiarly devoted to the worship of God, the Most High over all the earth, and accordingly they, especially the Germans, have been remarkable for musical talent, and particularly as to instrumental music, and the genius of their music appears to be very much like that of the Jews. With regard to poetry, in all its varieties, these nations have been remarkable. Poetry was greatly cultivated even among the operatives in the cities of Germany." Unquote. Wilson wrote that the Jews were a part of the 12 tribes of Israel, but that the people of Edom was also a part of the Jewish people. In the chapter entitled "The Jews or Judah mingled with Edom, etc.," he wrote, we quote, "John Hyrcanus, having conquered the Edomites, the Idumeans, reduced them to this necessity, either to embrace the Jewish religion or else to leave the country and seek new dwellings elsewhere. They chose to leave their idolatry rather than their country, and all became proselytes to the Jewish religion. And when they had thus taken on them the religion of the Jews, they continued united to them ever after, till at length the name of the Edomites was lost in that of the Jews, and both peoples became consolidated into one and the same nation together. Say we these things, do we then bring forward these historical truths for the purpose of disparaging the Jew? No, far be it, but to illustrate the truth respecting Israel, and to show that those who were taken out of the land cannot be more lost among the Gentiles than were the people that remained in the land. But shall they be excluded? No. Unquote. And if you would like to know more about the lost tribes of Israel, you can buy my book, The Lost 10 Tribes of Israel in Europe, which I published last year. It is 352 pages, and you can buy it on Amazon. The price, excluding postage and handling, is $9 for the paperback version, $17 for the hardcover version, and $2 for the Kindle ebook. The Kindle ebook is, of course, without any postage and handling. And as I said, you can buy it on Amazon. Edward Hine, who lived 1825 to 1891. Edward Hine was an English bank clerk who was inspired by a lecture by John Wilson, which he had heard when he was 15 years old. In 1869, Hine delivered his first public lecture on the subject. Contrary to John Wilson, who believed that the Germans were Israelites, Edward Hine believed that the Germans were Assyrians. Edward Hine believed that only the Anglo-Saxons and not the Scandinavians, nor the Germans, nor the Dutch, nor the French were the 10 tribes of Israel, and he also believed that the Jews, they were Judah. Edward Hine himself inspired Edward Byrd, also known as Philo Israel, but Hine and Byrd became rivals. Their main point of contention was that Hine viewed only the Anglo-Saxons and the Jews as Israel and Judah respectively, while Byrd viewed both the Anglo-Saxons and related peoples as Israel. As Byrd outdid Hine in popularity, the latter turned to the United States, where he spread his teachings. Edward Wheeler Byrd, also known as Philo Israel, who lived 1823 to 1903. Edward Byrd was a British civil servant in the Indian Civil Service and one of the leading British Israelites of the late Victorian age. In 1874, Byrd became active in the British Israel movement after reading John Wilson's book, and in 1877 he began publishing the magazine The Banner of Israel, which in 1926 was incorporated into The National Message, the organ of the British Israel World Federation, which was founded in 1919. Philo Israel, or Edward Byrd, wrote numerous books. Among them are The English, The Lost Tribes of Israel from 1876 and Geography at the Gates in 1880. Jonathan Holt Titcomb, who lived 1819 to 1887. Jonathan Titcomb was an English clergyman and the first bishop of Rangoon in British Burma, which today is Yangon in Myanmar. Titcomb began his ministry in the Church of England as a curate in a parish in Cambridge, where a portion of the population belonged to the most unfortunate sections of society. But he soon made himself popular and drew many to church, also due to his open-air preaching. Later, Titcomb was transferred to London, where he debated with atheists in the Bradlaugh Hall of Science, named after the infamous atheist Charles Bradlaugh, who later came to faith in God and the Bible after having come to faith in the British Israel teaching. In 1877, in Westminster Abbey, Titcomb was ordained bishop of the new Anglican Diocese of Rangoon, Burma. In Burma, Titcomb fervently missionized, baptized, and confirmed among the natives, but in 1881 he fell over a cliff in the Karen Hills, and in 1882 he had to resign from his bishopric and returned to England. There he, as the coadjutor to the Bishop of London, became the supervisor for English chaplains in 10 nations in North and Central Europe. Titcomb was president of the Metropolitan Anglo-Israel Association and known as a courageous and fearless man in his proclamation of the British Israel truth. In his first book, The Anglo-Israel Postback from 1875, Titcomb answered objections to British Israelism and wrote, we quote, "The 10 tribes voluntarily started off on a line of migration into other heathen lands out of Assyria, where they lay as dead bones in all the darkness of idolatry and unknown and unblessed of God. Assuming this to be the case, which is just what the Anglo-Israel theorists maintain, we should have a representation of the Teutonic and Celtic races, or at least a large portion of them, lying in Britain, Gaul, Germany, Denmark, and Scandinavia, waiting to be collected into one compact and nationalized mass." Bishop Titcomb explained that the reason why the nations of northwestern Europe became Protestant during the Reformation was because they were the descendants of the Israelites, and the reason why southern Europe remained Catholic was because they were, generally speaking, of Gentile ancestry. We quote, "Every Protestant nation is Teutonic. Did it never strike you as a man of thought to be very singular that every Protestant nation should belong to the Teutonic family? This has been often observed. Indeed, some writers have so intensified the circumstance as to endeavor to argue from it that Protestantism and Roman Catholicism are not so much matters of belief as of race. They contend that the Latin races of Europe are almost incapable, on ethnological grounds, of ever becoming Protestant, while the Teutonic peoples are, by their psychological condition, everywhere disposed to it. I believe in nothing of the kind. No, the reason does not lie in any stereotyped form of psychological incapacity to become Protestant. It is not a question of race. It is not a question which has to be settled by any of the laws of ethnology." And again we quote, "To my own mind, the Anglo-Israel interpretation of prophecy is enough to make everything clear. For if the Teutonic race be of Israelitish origin, and the Anglo-Saxon a mere special embodiment of them, then all this unity in Protestant faith and feeling falls into its proper place in Christendom, and remarkably illustrates the truth of this wonderful theory." Unquote. John Cox Gawler, who lived 1830 to 1882. John Cox Gawler was a colonel and keeper of the British crown jewels at the Tower of London. Colonel Gawler served in the Kaffir War 1850 to 1853 and was 8 times honorably mentioned in official reports. In September 1855 he was appointed a special magistrate in British Kaffraria, and his energetic action there led to the annexation of Crellis territory. Colonel Gawler is best remembered for his book Dan the Pioneer of Israel from 1880, which was published in Danish in 1993 under the title Dan, Israels Pioner, by Palma forlaget, and he also wrote Our Scythian Ancestors in 1875 and The 2 Olive Trees in 1880. Henry Grattan Guinness, who lived 1835 to 1910. Henry Grattan Guinness was a British-Irish Protestant evangelist. For 12 years, Guinness, who was also of the famous Brewer family of the same name, traveled around the world preaching. He was appointed director of the Livingstone Inland Mission in 1880 and founder and director of the East London Institute for Home and Foreign Missions between 1873 and 1910, and founded missions in 5 other countries which were consolidated into this institute. Guinness also founded the mission magazine The Regions Beyond in 1878. In his famous book Light for the Last Days, published in 1886, Grattan Guinness wrote, based on biblical calculations and British Israel teachings, that Jerusalem would be taken by Great Britain in 1917, which also did take place when General Allenby took Jerusalem between the 9th and 11th of December in 1917. Grattan Guinness calculated the time when the city of Jerusalem would be liberated from Gentile rulership, or when the so-called times of the Gentiles spoken of by Jesus in Luke chapter 21 verse 24 would end. Grattan Guinness based this calculation upon the 7 times that God would punish Israel, which for Judah and the city of Jerusalem started in 604 BC with the Babylonian capture of Jerusalem. 7 times, or 2,520 years after 604 BC, was AD 1917, which was approximately the year in which Grattan Guinness believed Jerusalem would no longer be under Gentile rule. Writing in 1886, Grattan Guinness wrote that in the future year 1917, Jerusalem would be under Israelite rule. We quote, "The astronomical features of this measurement of the 7 times are not as remarkable as are those of 2 other measurements, that from the first of Nebuchadnezzar and that from his final overthrow of Zedekiah. It was in the year BC 606 that Nebuchadnezzar first came against Judah and carried Daniel and the Hebrew children, among others, captive. And this time he was acting on behalf of his father, and it was not until nearly 2 years later, BC 604, that he himself acceded to the throne. That year is consequently, properly speaking, the first of Nebuchadnezzar, and it was probably also the year in which he saw the vision of the great image, in connection with which it was said to him, 'Thou art this head of gold.' This year has therefore some special claims to be considered as a very principal starting point of the so-called times of the Gentiles. Measured from it, the period runs out in AD 1917, and it is a very notable fact that a second most remarkable period does the same. The 1,335 years of Daniel 12:12, the ne plus ultra of prophetic chronology, which is evidently Eastern in character and consequently lunar in scale, measured back from this year 1917, led up to the great Hijra era of Mohammedanism, the starting point of the Mohammedan calendar, the birthday of the power which has for more than 12 centuries desolated Palestine and trodden down Jerusalem." Unquote from Henry Grattan Guinness, Light for the Last Days, published in 1886, pages 252 to 253. The Gentile Ottoman Turks conquered Jerusalem in 1517. In 1917, the British Army under General Allenby took Jerusalem, and Palestine became British-ruled Mandatory Palestine. Since Grattan Guinness had calculated that Gentile rule over Jerusalem would end in 1917, it must mean that Israelite rule over Jerusalem would start in 1917. That was exactly what happened when Ephraim Britain took control of Jerusalem. Grattan Guinness's prophetic book even played a role in the British capture of Jerusalem. The New Zealand author Andrew Adams wrote the remarkable book As Birds Flying in 1992, where he described how General Sir Beauvoir de Lille convinced General Allenby to be in command of the Palestine operation, even though Allenby was not keen on. We quote, "Sir Beauvoir, who was later to preach a sermon at St. Martin in the Fields regarding the capture of Jerusalem, consoled him," that is Allenby, "with the biblical predictions contained in a book published in the 1880s by Dr. and Mrs. H. Grattan Guinness, Light for the Last Days. These predictions pointed to 1917 as the year of the deliverance of Jerusalem from Turkish rule. Allenby was much impressed by these predictions, as he also was by a book called Fullness of the Nations, written by another eminent prophetic biblical student, Dr. H. Aldersmith. In this book, Aldersmith said Jerusalem would fall to Great Britain in 1917. As well as meeting with government and military officials, Allenby was summoned to a meeting with the first Sea Lord, the redoubtable Lord Fisher. This summons puzzled Allenby. Did the Royal Navy wish for a higher profile in the coming campaign as befitting the senior service? Allenby would soon find out. In one of the most extraordinary discussions of the entire war, recorded for posterity by Lord Fisher's secretary, Allenby was told that he would be, as commander-in-chief, God's instrument for Jerusalem's capture in December 1917. Stunned by the frankness of Lord Fisher's revelation, Allenby politely asked how Britain's most distinguished living sailor had come to this deduction. The hours rolled by as Lord Fisher explained to Allenby the Israelitish origins of the Anglo-Saxon Celtic peoples, the covenants made by God to the nation of Israel, Israel's position in the latter days, the biblical prophecies that had ordained the growth of the British Empire, and lastly the prophecies relating to the capture of Jerusalem in December 1917. Lord Fisher also told Allenby that aircraft, as birds flying, a quote from Isaiah chapter 31, verse 5, that aircraft would be absolutely essential for the success of the campaign. Allenby eventually took his leave of Lord Fisher while thoughtfully considering all that had been said. Unquote from Andrew Adams' book, As Birds Flying, pages 41 to 42. Before the British Army entered Palestine, the German Air Force dominated the skies over Palestine. But General Allenby made it a priority that the Royal Flying Corps, which later became the Royal Air Force, would have air supremacy. During the first days of December 1917, the Royal Flying Corps, with plenty of new airplanes and a new spirit of aggression among its pilots, did take the air supremacy from the German Air Force. On the 9th of December, the Turks surrendered Jerusalem to the British, and on the 11th of December, General Allenby, along with Lawrence of Arabia and military attachés from Britain's allies, humbly entered Jerusalem through the Jaffa Gate on foot. The British armed forces thereby fulfilled Isaiah's words written 2,500 years before. As birds flying, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending also he will deliver it, and passing over he will preserve it. Unquote from Isaiah chapter 31, verse 5. Charles Bradlaugh, who lived 1833 to 1891. Charles Bradlaugh was on the English King's Council and a member of Parliament, but primarily known for being one of Britain's most infamous atheists in the 19th century, and he was also the founder of the National Secular Society, which he founded in 1866. One day, Bradlaugh stood before a great audience in London with a Bible in his hand. He then read from the Bible about God's covenant with Abraham, and then asked, quote, "Have those promises ever been fulfilled in the Jews?" Unquote. There were no replies in the affirmative. He then said, "And you tell me the God of that book is a God of truth? I don't believe it." Unquote. Bradlaugh then went on to become one of the most infamous infidels and opponents of Christianity of his day. Initially, he was barred from Parliament because of his atheism, but he later won the appeal and his seat in Parliament. Later in his life, he learned of the British-Israel teaching and then got full faith in the Bible. Of the British-Israel meetings, Charles Bradlaugh said, we quote, "I love to come. It is most wonderful what light British-Israel truth throws on the Bible." Unquote. Eliezer Basson, who was born in 1840 and passed away in 1898. Eliezer Basson was born into a wealthy Jewish family in Mogilev in the Russian Empire. Today it is in Belarus. But he converted to Christianity and moved to Britain, where he came to believe in British Israelism. In his booklet, British and Jewish Fraternity, Basson wrote, we quote, The Hebrew scriptures points to the British Isles as the home of God's firstborn. It is my conviction that Britain is the nation with whom God has, from first to last, identified himself. I, as an Israelite of the house of Judah, claim you as Israelites of the house of Ephraim. As believers in the faithfulness of our covenant-keeping God, I call you to awake from your sleep." Unquote. In a series of lectures entitled God's Dealings with His Chosen People Israel, delivered in Portobello in Scotland in 1884, where Basson explained why the Anglo-Saxon and related peoples were the lost 10 tribes of Israel, he said, quote, "Before I became a Christian, I believed, as the most of my Jewish brethren still believe, that the 10 tribes of Israel exist somewhere as a powerful nation, having a king of their own, and that they are hidden from the sight of men until the coming of the expected Messiah. I, as an Israelite of the house of Judah, claim you as my brethren, as Israelites of the house of Ephraim, and ask you to remember your brethren, the Jews, more earnestly in your prayers before the Lord, that the time may soon come when the house of Judah shall walk to the house of Israel, and they shall come together out of the land of the north, to the land that I have given for an inheritance unto your fathers." Unquote from Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 18. Yes, dear brethren, I firmly believe that the Jews who are called by Jeremiah the house of Judah will in due time recognize the British people as their own kindred of the house of Israel, and enjoy at seeing their lost brother Ephraim raised in the marvelous providence of God to a position of such preeminence in the world, will come and ask Britain to restore them to the land of promise. At that time the Lord will order events so that Palestine, with the Euphrates as a boundary, will come into British possession, and the land will become inhabited by Britons who are of Ephraim, Israel, and by Jews who are of Judah, Israel. Let us thank God that to our lot has fallen the high honor of aiding in the fulfilling of God's great and glorious purpose in bringing to light the 10-tribed kingdom of Israel, which has been hidden so long from the sight of men, in order to enable the house of Judah to walk to the house of Israel, and help them to return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. A quote from Hosea chapter 3 verse 5, and unquote from Eliezer Basson. John Charles Ryle, who lived 1816 to 1900. John Charles Ryle was Bishop of Liverpool in the Church of England. J.C. Ryle was considered one of the greatest scholars of his day. He wrote, quote, "I warn you that unless you interpret the prophetic portion of the Old Testament in the simple literal meaning of its words, you will find it no easy matter to carry on an argument with an intelligent Jew. Will you dare to tell me that Zion, Jerusalem, Jacob, Judah, Ephraim, Israel did not mean what they seem to mean, but mean the Church of Christ? I believe it is high time for the Church of Christ to awake out of its sleep about Old Testament prophecy. For centuries there has prevailed in the churches of Christ an unwarrantable mode of dealing with the word Israel. It has been interpreted in many passages of the Psalms and Prophets as if it meant nothing more than Christian believers. Have promises been held out to Israel? Men have been continually told that they were addressed to Gentile saints. Have glorious things been described as laid up in store for Israel? Men have been insistently told that they described the victories and triumphs of the gospel in Christian churches. In reading the words which God addressed to his ancient people, never lose sight of the primary sense of the text. Unquote from J.C. Ryle. Charles Piazzi Smith, who lived 1819 to 1900. Charles Piazzi Smith was a British astronomer and Astronomer Royal for Scotland. Smith was born in Naples, Italy, to British parents. His father was Captain and later Admiral William Henry Smith. He acquired his middle name from his godfather, the Italian astronomer Giuseppe Piazzi. Piazzi Smith is a highly respected astronomer. A 13-kilometer wide moon crater is named after him, and the 21-kilometer wide asteroid Piazzi Smith between Mars and Jupiter is also named after him. Professor Charles Piazzi Smith wrote, we quote, "The effect of the discovery of the identity of the Anglo-Saxons as Israel is twofold. First, it causes us to behold and acknowledge therein the accomplishments of a true miracle, and of the mightiest kind, through the ages, consummated in our own days. Second, it causes the Bible to become for us, as it was for the tribes of Israel of old, an infallible book for national guidance, as well as a collection of inspired instructions for each individual soul in religion." Unquote. William Bennett Bond, who lived 1805 to 1906. William Bennett Bond was Bishop of Montreal in the Anglican Church of Canada between 1879 and 1906. Bishop Bond stated, quote, "I strongly advise study of the scripture prophecies upon British-Israel lines." Unquote. Samuel Thornton, who lived 1835 to 1917. Samuel Thornton was the first Anglican bishop of Ballarat in Victoria in Australia. Samuel Thornton was born in London, England, and at Westminster Abbey in 1875 he was appointed the first bishop of Ballarat, Australia. He was held in high esteem and was described as, quote, "probably the best scholar on the Australian Episcopal bench of his day" by the Australian Dictionary of Biography from 1976. In 1900, Thornton resigned and travelled back to England, where he became Assistant Bishop of Manchester in the Church of England. Bishop Thornton said, quote, "British Israel truth is most wonderful. I wish I had known it 25 years earlier. It makes clear so many things that had been obscure." Unquote. John Arbuthnot Fisher, who lived 1853 to 1920. John Arbuthnot Fisher was Lord and First Baron of Kilverstone. He was also a British naval admiral who is known for his huge reforms of the Royal Navy. Admiral Fisher served in the Crimean War in 1856 and in the Second Opium War 1856 to 1860. In the Anglo-Egyptian War in 1882, Fisher was captain of the HMS Inflexible and bombarded the port of Alexandria. As Vice Admiral in 1896 and Full Admiral in 1901, he was Chief of the Naval Mediterranean Station between 1899 and 1902, and First Sea Lord 1904 to 1910, and again in 1914 to 1915. Admiral Fisher opposed Churchill's Gallipoli plan and argued for the Baltic Plan, an attack on the German Baltic coast. The Gallipoli attack turned out to be a disaster. Lord Fisher is by some viewed as the second most important figure in British naval history after Lord Nelson. He was also a close friend of King Edward VII. In 1919, Admiral Fisher wrote a letter to the Times of London arguing that the headquarters of the newly formed League of Nations should be in Jerusalem and not in Geneva, wherein he wrote that, quote, "The only hypothesis to explain why we win in spite of incredible blunders is that we are the lost 10 tribes of Israel." Unquote. Admiral Fisher is also credited as the first person to use the colloquial initialism OMG, standing for "Oh my God," in a letter to Winston Churchill dated the 9th of September 1917. And that's from an online article by Rachel Newer. The first use of OMG was in a 1917 letter to Winston Churchill. So just remember, when you hear OMG, that's a term coined by a British Israelite. Farrar Fenton, who lived 1832 to 1920. Farrar Fenton was a businessman from London who spent 50 years translating the Bible from the original languages with the goal to study the Bible absolutely in its original languages, to ascertain what its writers actually said and thought. Farrar Fenton's translation is commonly referred to as the Farrar Fenton Bible. He was descended from Roger Fenton, who lived 1565 to 1615, who worked on translating the 1611 authorized King James Version of the Bible. In February 1888, Fenton engaged in a formal debate in Yorkshire, England, where he defended the British Israel message. William Ferguson Massey, who lived 1856 to 1925. William Ferguson Massey was Prime Minister of New Zealand between 1912 and 1925. Massey was born in County Londonderry, Northern Ireland, in a Presbyterian family, and he came to New Zealand with his family in 1870. He was seen as one of the most skilled politicians of his day. He is the second longest serving Prime Minister in New Zealand history. Prime Minister Massey said, quote, "British Israel truth is God's truth. It is therefore bound to win. It is winning all along the line." Unquote. John Hardin Allen, 1847 to 1930. John Hardin Allen was an American pastor in the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Wesleyan Methodist Church, and the Church of God Holiness. J. H. Allen was from Illinois, but later moved to California. J. H. Allen wrote several books, one of which was the Anglo-Israel classic Judah's Scepter and Joseph's Birthright, written in 1902. Edward Faraday Odlum, 1850 to 1935. Edward Faraday Odlum was a respected Canadian professor, historian, scientist, educator, lecturer, and fellow of American Geographical Society. According to Judge Howey, a noted British Columbia historian, Odlum, under the direction of Dr. Haenel, built the first electric light, a big arc light, used in Canada. And in collaboration they built the first telephones used in Canada for public purposes. Odlum and Haenel founded the Science Association at Victoria University, Toronto in Canada. Here Odlum was instrumental in getting named a building after himself, the Faraday Hall, the first building in Ontario devoted to the teaching of science. Odlum taught at public schools, at the Collegiate Institute at Coburg, was principal at Pembroke High School, and in 1886 he became principal at a college in Tokyo in Japan, under the Canadian Methodist Church. In Japan he continued his scientific studies and studied the ethnology and history of the Japanese. Odlum took some of the phones he had made in Canada to be used in Japan. In 1889 he returned to Canada, to Vancouver. While visiting relatives, he met a lady who knew of his great interest in history. She asked him if he had ever considered the possibility that the Anglo-Saxons and related peoples were the descendants of the ancient Israelites. He immediately replied that the notion was pure nonsense, but he could not get the idea out of his head and began writing a paper refuting the idea. After only a few days' study, he realized the subject was far greater and involved more than he had imagined. It was not long before he realized it could not be refuted because it was true. Odlum became very important to the British Israelites in Vancouver, and he was also granted permission to examine the stone of Skun, the stone which the British monarchs are crowned upon, and proved that this stone did not originate from the British Isles. He traveled to Palestine and found a similar rock formation near Luz. The patriarch Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, slept upon this rock when he had the dream of Jacob's ladder. Odlum wrote daily articles for the newspapers Vancouver Daily Star and Vancouver Sun, and in the 1920s and 1930s he made 2 weekly radio broadcasts. A small street in Vancouver is even named after Edward Odlum. Edward Odlum's son was the well-known Canadian journalist, soldier and diplomat General Victor Odlum, and he was also a British Israelite. Edward Odlum wrote several books about the tribes of Israel, such as God's Covenant Man, British-Israel in 1927, and one of his articles was printed in the Danish Evangeliebladet in 1927. Evangeliebladet was the paper of the Apostolic Church in Denmark, which was founded by Anna and Sigurd Bjørner, who were outspoken proponents of the message about the 10 tribes of Israel here in Denmark, where I'm from. William Pascoe Gort, 1863 to 1937. William Pascoe Gort was an English Methodist clergyman for more than 40 years and may be the most prominent British Israelite of the first half of the 20th century. Gort was born in Cornwall in England but moved to Canada, where he in 1912 became pastor of the Knox Congregational Church in Vancouver, later renamed Grandview Congregational Church after it relocated to another district in Vancouver. Gort became vice president in the British Israel World Federation in 1921 and editor of the National Message when it was founded in 1922. In 1930, Gort attended a special ceremony at the College of Laws in Chicago, where he was awarded the degree Doctor of Laws and Logic by Chancellor Dubois in recognition of excellent scholarship for his book The Law of the Lord, The Common Law, written in 1928. In June 1930, he wrote his first manifesto entitled The Present Menace and How to Meet It, which was published in 21 newspapers in Britain. In 1931, he wrote his second manifesto, The World Crisis, which was also printed in many British papers and also in the Danish Evangeliebladet. Gort helped establish the Harold Weald Park College in 1933, which was a British Israel teaching college. It was closed during World War II when the army used it, but opened again under the name Garrison Bible College. George Campbell Morgan, 1863 to 1945. George Campbell Morgan was an English Congregationalist minister and evangelist. At the age of 10, Morgan was converted by the famous American evangelist D.L. Moody and preached his first sermon at the age of 13. At the age of 15, he preached regularly in his own and the neighboring parishes. Morgan's reputation as a preacher and Bible interpreter soon became so known that D.L. Moody asked him to hold a lecture at the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. After Moody's death in 1899, Morgan was chosen as his successor. In 1904, he returned to England and took over the pastorate of the White Elephant of Congregationalism, the Westminster Congregational Chapel, a dying church at Buckingham Gate in London. In 1919, Morgan left the church as one of England's most active and well-known churches. He served at the faculty of the Bible Institute of Los Angeles between 1927 and 28 and was a Bible lecturer at Gordon College of Theology and Missions in Boston, Massachusetts, 1930 to 1931. Morgan was also pastor at the Tabernacle Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, between 1929 and 1932. He returned to England and from 1933 to 1943, he was once again pastor at the Westminster Congregational Chapel. Charles Marston, 1867 to 1946. Charles Marston was son and heir of the English industrialist John Marston from Wolverhampton, who founded and owned Sunbeam, which made the highest quality bicycles on the British market until 1936, and Sunbeam Motor Car Company, which produced cars and motorcycles between 1905 and 1934. Charles Marston was president of the anti-Darwinist Victoria Institute between 1942 and 1946. He was the president of the Shropshire Archaeological Society and financially supported its excavations across Palestine from 1929. Charles Marston also financially supported John Garstang's excavations of Jericho, which by and large supported the biblical narrative of the conquest of Jericho. Charles Marston wrote several books, including The Bible Comes Alive, written in 1937, and The Bible is True, written in 1938. On February the 2nd, 1929, Marston said in a lecture in Caxton Hall in Westminster in London, quote, "Great Britain was the first of all nations to adopt Christianity. Bible study and the result of the Great War are forcing me to the certain conclusion that today we as a nation represent the lost sheep of the house of Israel. We are in the peculiar position that upon us, both as a church and a people, may depend the whole future civilization of the world." Unquote. William Grant, 1883 to 1949. William Grant was Member of Parliament for the Ulster Unionist Party, who spoke alongside the British Israel preacher Maxwell Carnson at a meeting in Belfast in 1931. William Grant was both Minister of Security, Minister of Labour and Minister of Health in the government of Northern Ireland. King George VI, who lived 1895 to 1952. King George VI, he was King of Great Britain between 1936 and 1952, and King of Ireland until 1949, and Emperor of India until 1947. George VI was born Prince Albert Frederick Arthur George. That was his birth name. His maternal grandmother, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, did not like his first name, Albert, and she wrote prophetically that she hoped the last name may supplant the less favored one. His father, George V, had severe reservations about letting his firstborn, Edward, become king, and said shortly before his death, quote, "I pray God that my eldest son will never marry, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." Unquote. Bertie was Albert, and Lilibet was his daughter, the late Queen Elizabeth II. In January 1936, Edward became king under the name Edward VII, but he abdicated in December of the same year in order to marry an American woman who was divorced 2 times and whose ex-husbands were still alive. Edward VII was a well-known Nazi sympathizer, and the Nazis had a plan to make him a puppet king if they were able to successfully invade Britain during World War II. In 1996, in a series of letters from the then Duke Albert George of York, the future King George VI, they were made public. And in a letter from 1922, the later George VI wrote, we quote, "I am sure that this British-Israelite business is true. I have read a lot about it lately, and everything, no matter how large or small, points to our being the chosen race." Unquote. That was published in the Independent Weekend on the 6th of April 1996. And by the way, I have talked with many British Israelites who say that many British monarchs have believed in British Israel. The theologian and left-wing Green Party member Aidan Cottrell Boyce confirmed this in his detailed and surprisingly unbiased history of the British Israel movement entitled Israelism in Modern Britain, written in 2022, where Aidan Cottrell Boyce writes, quote, "There have long been rumors that the crowned heads of Britain were secret supporters of the British Israel cause." Unquote. David Davidson, 1884 to 1956. David Davidson was a Scottish pyramidologist. Davidson was a British Israelite and a big name within pyramidology. His books on pyramidology are sold in alternative circles to this day. Among other works, he wrote The Great Pyramid, Its Divine Message in 1924 and Iceland's Great Inheritance in 1937. George Jeffreys, 1889 to 1962. George Jeffreys was a Welshman and one of the leading voices in the Pentecostal awakening in Britain in the 1910s, and founded the Elim Pentecostal Church. George Jeffreys was also a firm British Israelite. This, among other things, caused him to leave the church he had founded and start a new church in 1939. Before his death, George Jeffreys was visited by a 21-year-old German evangelist, Reinhard Bonke, and passed on his mantle to Bonke. Reinhard Bonke went on to become one of the most successful evangelists in Africa. Princess Alice, Duchess of Athlone, who lived 1883 to 1981. Princess Alice, Duchess of Athlone, was the last surviving grandchild of Queen Victoria. For much of her life, Princess Alice was the chief patron of the British Israel movement and attended the annual Congress of the British Israel World Federation for several decades. Robert Bradford, who lived 1941 to 1981. Robert Bradford started out as a footballer and later became a Methodist minister and Ulster Unionist member of Parliament from 1974 to 1981, and he was also a British Israelite. Robert Bradford was assassinated by the IRA in 1981. Bob Danvers Walker, who lived 1906 to 1990. Bob Danvers Walker was a top media personality in Britain from the 1940s to 1970s. As Cottrell Boyce writes in his book, his name is practically forgotten now, but for several decades his name was familiar to the majority of the British public. Bob Danvers Walker was broadcaster to the British troops on Radio Normandy during the D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944. Later he hosted a number of talk shows and game shows, including the British version of Wheel of Fortune and Take Your Pick. Danvers Walker was also a staunch British Israelite and spoke at many British Israel meetings. Patience Strong, who lived 1907 to 1990. Patience Strong, which was a pen name for Winifred May, her real name, and Patience Strong was most known for her poems, most of which were published in the Daily Mirror, to this day one of the leading newspapers in England, from the 1940s to 1970s. Aidan Cottrell Boyce mentions that, quote, many of the poems that Strong published in the pages of the Daily Mirror express definitely British Israelist sentiments, unquote. For example, on page 7 of the Daily Mirror from the 27th of June 1940, which was during the height of the Battle of Britain, Patience Strong wrote the poem entitled Israel. Quote, the veil is lifted. Now we know our name, our task, our place. God is working out his purpose through the British race, and will set his kingdom up according to the word. Israel must contend with Satan. Let these truths be heard and understood, unquote, from the Daily Mirror, the 27th of June 1940. John Dunlop, who lived 1910 to 1996. John Dunlop was a member of the British Parliament for the United Ulster Unionist Party from 1974 to 1983, and he was also a British Israelite. Walter Walker, who lived 1912 to 2001. Walter Walker was a British general who ended up as Commander-in-Chief of the NATO forces in Northern Europe. Walter Walker was born of British parents in India and fought against Japan in Burma during World War II. As colonel, Walter Walker fought the communist rebels in Malaya during the Malayan Emergency 1948 to 1960. As brigadier and later major general, Walker was commander of the Commonwealth forces during the confrontation with Indonesia over Borneo 1962 to 1965. Between 1969 and 1972, Walter Walker was chief of NATO's Northern Command and NATO's commander-in-chief of Allied forces in Northern Europe, which meant Norway, Denmark, and Northern Germany. General Walter Walker was an arch-conservative and anti-communist as well as a British Israelite. He was a prolific writer in British Israel magazines in the 1970s and 1980s. So if World War III had started between 1969 and 1972, the armed forces of my country, Denmark, they would have been under the supreme command of a British Israel general, Walter Walker. Sir Edward Macmillan Teddy Taylor, who lived 1937 to 2017. Sir Edward Macmillan Teddy Taylor was a member of the British Parliament for the Conservative Party, and he was also a British Israelite and spoke at the British-Israel World Federation, their conference in Glasgow in 1976. He was a member of Parliament for the Tories between 1964 and 2005. Nelson McCausland, who is born in 1951. Nelson McCausland has been a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly for the Democratic Unionist Party and a Minister of Culture, Arts and Leisure between 2009 and 2011, and Minister of Social Development 2011 to 2014. Nelson McCausland is also a British Israelite and has spoken at events organized by the British-Israel World Federation. And actually, just in the recent edition of Covenant Nations, the magazine of the British-Israel World Federation, Nelson McCausland wrote several articles. These British Israelite witnesses to the Israelite origin of the Western nations are only the tip of the iceberg of the many people that have believed in this theory. Therefore, we see that among the people that have believed that the Western nations are the lost tribes of Israel are great kings, princesses, clergymen, high-ranking generals, respected members of the parliaments of the UK, Northern Ireland and New Zealand, and revered poets. The fact that so many respected men and women have believed in the British Israel message should therefore make it clear both to Christian Israelites and their opponents that this belief is not a weird or fringe belief.